All right, well, let's take a look at our study tonight. We are in Heaven Bible Study Part 61, and last week we did look at the Book of Ezra. And just a quick summary of that lesson, we saw that God rules from heaven. It was mentioned over and over again, the God of heaven, in the Book of Ezra. And we see that God is sovereign over all of creation, and certainly we'll see that God is sovereign yet again in our study tonight as we look at Esther. We also saw that God's house, his temple, was rebuilt just as promised as the Jewish people came back to Jerusalem. We also saw that God saved a remnant of Israel as promised, and those who seek and follow God find mercy. So our heaven definition for this study: heaven is a spiritual realm where the greatest intensity of God's presence dwells eternally. It is a holy place because God is there. It is where God rules from his throne in the heavenly temple, with the resurrected Jesus at his right hand, holy angels and the souls of the redeemed, those that have been forgiven by grace through faith, live in heaven. Satan currently has access to the heavenly courtroom and accuses the saints daily. One day, Satan will be cast out of the heavenly courtroom forever. The souls of the redeemed saints will be reunited with resurrected and glorified bodies and will dwell on earth with Jesus for 1,000 years. After the millennium, God will create a new universe on earth. Heaven will come down to earth, and the redeemed will live forever with God in a glorified body on the new earth. So if you would turn with me to page 4 tonight. So we are going to be looking at the Book of Esther. So Esther occurs basically between chapter 6 and chapter 7 of Ezra. We don't know for sure who wrote the Book of Esther. Some think Ezra may have. It may have been Mordecai or some other Persian Jew. But this occurs between the first return of the exiles in 538 and the second return in 458 BC. So it is from 483 to 473 is when this whole story takes place. And an interesting thing about the Book of Esther is God is never explicitly named. But you see God's hand throughout the entire book. And we'll see some things that maybe are kind of hidden in there tonight. But I'll say right from the beginning, we're looking at a Heaven Bible study. Heaven is not mentioned in the Book of Esther. So there's some other things we're going to look at. And as we've gone through this study, we've seen other things that the Jewish people were looking forward to, in the fact that God is faithful, that he was going to bless those who blessed them and curse those who cursed them, and that God is sovereign, and that God really is the only one who saves. And we'll find that actually hidden in this text tonight as well. So does anybody know what holiday came from the Book of Esther? Purim. Purim is a Jewish holiday, and I wouldn't say it's a coincidence as we're talking about God's sovereignty. It's actually March 23rd and 24th, so it's this weekend. It is. I thought about making some of the traditional cakes they had. I didn't have time to do it, but they make these things called Haman's Pockets, and they look like triangles, and they have little jellies and jams and things like that in the middle. And it's shaped like a triangle, and they're not really sure why. They think that Haman may have had a three-pointed hat. It's not mentioned in the text. But it's also possible it's the shape of the lot that he cast to decide when he was going to kill the Jews. And it's called his pockets because it was the money part of the story that we'll see tonight with Haman as well. Also, whenever they would read the Book of Esther on Purim, I think it's 13th century, it started that people would make noise anytime Haman's name was read. So they might have a noisemaker or have his name written on their shoe, and every time Haman, everybody would be like stomping their foot to blot out his name. And that's something that's in the text too, that his name. And on the Purim, this is how the holiday is celebrated. They exchange gifts of food and drink. They donate charity to the poor. They eat a celebration meal, and there's a public reading of the scroll of Esther, usually in the synagogue. Also, after reading these daily prayers, they have grace for the meals, and some groups of Jews actually apply henna as well during the time of Purim. So before they would read the book of Esther, and I'm going to read this. This is the prayer blessing they do at Purim. It says, "Blessed are you, my Lord, our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and has commanded us regarding the reading of the Megillah." So that's where Esther is at in the Old Testament. "Blessed are you, my Lord, our God, King of the universe, who has wrought miracles for our forefathers in those days at this season. Blessed are you, my Lord, our God, King of the universe, who has kept us alive, sustained us, and brought us to this season." So if you wonder what the Jews believe about Esther, I think that tells a lot. They believe God is the God of the universe, that God has protected them and preserved them and blessed them in many ways. And we'll see this tonight. So I wanted to start just reading, kind of setting the ground of who Esther is. Esther 2, 5 through 7. It says, "In Shushan, the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimi, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter." So we have Jews that are in the Persian land, and King Ahasuerus Ahasuerus, and he's also known as Xerxes, is the king at the time. And a lot of people read Esther like a love story. Well, let me tell you, it's not a love story. It's the king is nasty, really. Because, whenever they have all the women presented before him, he's having sex more than likely with every one of those women to decide which one he wants to keep as his wife. In the beginning of the story, also, we have Vashti, who he was married to at the time. Now, some think that Vashti may have been pregnant whenever he called her to the banquet, and then he disposed of her because she refused to come to the banquet. Well, Xerxes went off and had war against the Greeks and lost a terrible battle. So then he comes back and he kind of regrets that he's gotten rid of Vashti. So he asked his wise men basically what he needed to do, his counselors. And they said, let's call all the virgins of the land and you'll get to pick your new wife from that. And so that's the story of Esther. It's nasty. It's not a love story. It's really showing God's sovereignty in the midst of a terrible situation. Now Mordecai, his father Kish, was a Benjamite, so he actually comes from the line with Saul, through Saul, and he had been carried away from Jerusalem whenever King Nebuchadnezzar had taken them in 539 BC. So his family had been there for a long time now, and Mordecai raised his uncle's daughter, Esther, who was the main character of this story. And we'll also see introduction to Haman. And Haman is an anti-Semite. We hear that term a lot in the news now. And it's something that's just been a reality for a long time for the Jewish people. People just naturally seem to hate the Jewish people. And Haman certainly did. And we'll see what comes of him in this story tonight. So as we look through the text, again, it doesn't say anything specifically about heaven, but we do see that there is somewhat a fear of death. And I think this is something that crosses cultures. People just have this natural fear of death kind of built into them. Now, some people maybe say they don't fear death, but I think often it's the mystery of death, and also, too, that we understand the wrath of God. Even if we don't really understand the wrath of God, we're worried about death. What's going to happen when we die. So these two passages are actually major parts in the book of Esther. So when Esther is brought the news by her uncle Mordecai that the Jewish people are going to be wiped out by Haman. Now, Esther is queen at this point, and Mordecai is telling her basically to stand up for the Jews, go before the king, and ask for him to intervene. Now, the king had not called her, I think it was for 30 days or something like that. And if you approach the king without his blessing or invitation, usually you were killed. Now, do you know why that was? It's because they didn't want an assassin just to come in there and approach the king. So if the king was having a visitor, it was somebody he had invited in. Now, ironically, Xerxes actually was assassinated later on. But that was the way. So the king didn't want you in there, they're going to kill you. Not going to let any threat approach the throne. So this is where Mordecai is asking Esther, and it's Esther 4:16. It says, "Go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan, and fast for me." So this is Esther saying this. "And fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise. And so I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Now at first she was a little bit hesitant about going before the king because this is threat of death. But we see a boldness in Esther as she says, if I perish, I perish. She's here for such a time as this to try to save the Jewish people. And if you notice, what does she ask? Gather all the Jews and ask them to do what? Fast. Now, it doesn't say it explicitly, but what is connected to fasting in Judaism? Prayer. And that is why they're fasting, is to seek God. So even though it doesn't say God's name explicitly, what is she asking for them to do? Pray for me. Pray for me that I won't perish and that God will intervene on behalf of me. So we see a boldness, and we're not told explicitly again if Esther is even a true believer. But I think we see in this boldness that she probably was confident in who God is, and she calls for the Jews to pray for her. Now, another view of death we see that just absolute fear is Haman. So the enemy. And this is at the end of the story, after it's already discovered that Haman is the one that's got the plot against the Jewish people to kill them. And Esther is a Jew as well. And he is absolutely terrified when the jig is up. This is Esther 7:6-9. "And Esther said, The adversary and enemy is the wicked Haman. So Haman was terrified before the king and queen." Why was he terrified?
He knew he could lose his life.
Exactly. "Then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther." So the king's he's mad and he walks away into the garden. But Haman and Queen Esther are still there. And what is Haman doing? He's pleading for his life. He is afraid to die. Afraid to die. For he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, "Will he also assault the queen while I am in the house?" So he wasn't trying to assault Esther, but that's what it looked like to the king. As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. So he's whisked away. His face is covered. Take him away. Now Harbonah, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, "Look, the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman." Then the king said, "Hang him on it." So as the story is progressing, Haman had actually built a gallows to have Mordecai killed. Mordecai the Jew. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that didn't happen immediately. But he builds these gallows, and there's 50 cubits high, which is probably higher than the city. So wherever they're standing at in the garden, they probably see those gallows. Now, what is your picture of Haman being hung on the gallows? What's your thought about that? How is he hung on the gallows? You probably think about a rope around his neck, right? That's not what they did. He was actually basically thrown on a stake, a spear. The Persians are probably the ones that actually invented crucifixion as well. But they would do this. They would just stick them down on a stake where they would suffer and die. And basically their dead bodies are left there to show everybody, don't mess with the king. Don't mess with... The Persians really just got very creative with their executions. Another thing they would do is they would take trees and they would bend 2 trees down, hold them down, tie somebody to both sides, and then let the trees go. And they'd rip them in half, and they would leave the half bodies up in the trees again as a warning to the people. So Haman was it wasn't a quick death. He was thrown on a spike and died that way. And there really are 3 charges against Haman here. So one, he had manipulated the king to kill the queen's people. So the king didn't realize that Esther was a Jew. He also appeared to the king to be attacking the queen, so that's 2 strikes. And third, he had planned to kill Mordecai, who had honored and protected the king's life. So 3 strikes, and Haman is absolutely out. But going to the next page, and this is really the big story that's overarching throughout Esther, is that God is sovereign. God has protected the Jewish people again and again throughout history. We can say this even after we move away from the book of Esther in modern times as well. But Esther 4, 13 through 14. So this is Mordecai pleading with Esther. And I want you to just see what Mordecai obviously believes about God in this passage. And Mordecai told them to answer Esther, "Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews." So he's talking about that order that the king had made at request of Haman for all the Jews to be killed. And he's saying, don't think that just because you're the queen that you're not going to be killed. You're a Jew. In verse 14, "For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place." What does Mordecai believe about God? He's going to protect the people, isn't he? You know, you could think he's looking back all the way even to the covenant made with Abraham, that God is going to bless those who bless the Israelites and curse those who curse the Israelites. God has sovereignly protected them. And as the prophets spoke to Israel and Judah before they were taken away by Assyria and Babylon for Judah, they had promised that God would be with the faithful remnant. So Mordecai obviously understood this. So he's like, Esther, if you don't stand up, somebody is going to save the Jewish people. God is going to move a person to be there at the right time. He says, "But you and your father's house will perish if you don't do this, if you don't stand up. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this." There is God's sovereign hand, isn't it? He has placed Esther as queen. Now, was this something Esther was probably desiring to be in? I remember how the whole situation was. So the king had had sex with all these other virgins, and now he had sex with Esther, and he decides, hey, I like you the best. You're the queen. This is not a love story. And she hadn't even been before the king in like 30 days at this point in the story too. But God has placed her there. And Mordecai sees that. God is always placing his people in exactly where they need to be. We also see God moving on the king. This is Esther 6, 1 through 3. "That night the king could not sleep. So one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king." Now you remember they kept really good records, and Ezra probably had some of these records when he wrote his book as well. But he's asking for their history to be read before the king. This is something to lull him to sleep. I don't know if y'all have trouble sleeping at night, but ask someone to read the book of Chronicles to you. Verse 2, it says, "And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus." So if you remember, earlier in the story, these 2 eunuchs were plotting to assassinate the king. Mordecai heard wind of it, and he got it to Esther, and Esther told the king. So Mordecai has done good for the king. And the king says, verse 3, "Then the king said, 'What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?' And the king's servants who attended him said, 'Nothing has been done for him.'" So he's ready to do something for Mordecai, who had blessed the king, who had saved the king's life. So God really made it where the king couldn't sleep, that these chronicles were brought to him, that Mordecai's testimony was written, and now the king's ready to bless him. And now y'all remember the story. Who walks in the courtyard at that moment? Haman. And Haman has already built the gallows to hang said Mordecai. And the king's like, Haman, what would you do if there was somebody that, the king wanted to bless? And he goes on this big, long spiel because he's thinking, well, who would the king want to bless other than Haman? Well, he was asking for Mordecai, and Haman didn't know that. So then Haman has to take Mordecai down the street and says, look at what the king does for those who are good to him. He's blessing Mordecai. And you can just imagine how this made Haman feel. So God was moving. God was putting the right people in the right places at the right time. Going on further, we see in Esther 9, 1 through 3. Now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, the time came for the king's command and his decree to be executed. So this is after Haman has already been killed, but a law has been set by the Persian king, and that law cannot be changed. And what was the decree? That the Jews would be killed on this day. So what is he going to do about it? It says, on the day that the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred. Now the king actually allowed the Jewish people to fight back. So that was another decree from the king. They could defend themselves. Now these Jews, they weren't the soldiers in this empire. How in the world were they going to win this battle? Do we see that with God, with the Jewish people over and over again? They shouldn't have been able to win the battle, but God in his sovereignty gave them the victory. It says the Jews had hoped to overpower them. The opposite occurred, in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. Verse 2, the Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could withstand them, because fear of them fell upon all the people. So the Jews continued to win as the people were trying to kill them. They were killing the people instead. And notice that the fear of them fell upon all the people. Now you remember, as the Jewish people prepared to enter the promised land for the first time with Joshua, what had they heard in Jericho? Even when they were wandering through the wilderness, what had those people heard? The mighty acts of God and what God had done. And we'll see in a moment that those in the Persian Empire obviously had heard of what God had done as well. And so the people have fear, because these are the Jews. Their God has brought them out of Egypt. Their God has brought all these victories for them. And we're losing right now, so we better lay down arms. Verse 3, and all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work helped the Jews. Now there was a great hatred of the Jews in this empire, but now we have all these officials helping the Jews. Again, God is the one that's moving. He's changing the people's heart toward the Jews. And also look at this last part. They helped the Jews because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. So after Haman was killed, Mordecai was given a role of authority. So the people were afraid of him too. So now they're starting to respect and honor the Jews among them, because they're afraid they're going to die if they don't. Going on further, this is Esther 9, 11 through 13 and 15 through 17. On that day, the number of those who were killed in Shushan, the citadel, was brought to the king. Have you ever thought about this part? So, you know the Jews were supposed to be killed in the Book of Esther, but they weren't. They killed a tremendous amount of people. So, verse 12, and the king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men in Shushan, the citadel, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It shall be granted to you. Or what is your further request? It shall be done. Then Esther said, if it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are in Shushan to do again tomorrow according to today's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. So they're also going to be thrown on those spikes of spears. And this is why Purim is a 2-day celebration. So the first day where the Jews were supposed to be wiped out, they fought against people and killed a bunch. But they were afraid the next day the people were going to try to kill them again. So the king allowed them to fight back a second day. So that's why it's a 2-day holiday. In verse 15, and the Jews who were in Shushan gathered together again on the 14th day of the month of Adar and killed 300 men at Shushan, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. So they weren't stealing stuff or getting the gold of these people. They were just defending themselves. In verse 16, the remainder of the Jews in the king's provinces gathered together and protected their lives, had rest from their enemies. That sounds like a very familiar theme throughout. Rest from your enemies. What about the theme of heaven itself? Rest from our enemies. And they killed, look at this, 75,000 of their enemies. That was the people outside of the capital Shushan. 75,000 of their enemies. But they did not lay a hand on the plunder. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th of the month they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. So they had rest from their enemies. Now, The holiday of Purim, you're reading the whole book of Esther, remembering these things, how God had brought the victory for them. During World War II, or when Hitler was ruling in Germany, he banned the holiday of Purim. And he specifically said, look what these Jews did. They killed 75,000 of their enemies. They'll do the same to us if we don't stop them. So that anti-Semitism just continued on through history and continues on even today as well. But we see that God is the one that brought the victory. God is the one that's faithful always to his people. We also see in the book of Esther that Israel's history was well known among the people. You get hints of this through various passages. To start off in Esther 2 and 10, Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. Now, why do you think Mordecai did not want Esther to tell the king that she was Jewish, or anybody? They hated the Jews.
Yeah, right.
That's why. So he did not want her to share that information. And to go a little further with that, Esther 3, 1 through 7. So this is actually a dramatic play between two people groups. So, and I'll just read this little blurb here from John MacArthur. I thought it was great about this. The historical genesis for the drama played out between Mordecai, a Benjamite descendant of Saul, and Haman, an Agagite, goes back almost 1,000 years when the Jews exited from Egypt and were attacked by the Amalekites. So after they had come out of Egypt and they were going through the wilderness, the Amalekites had attacked them. It says, whose lineage began with Amalek, grandson of Esau. And God pronounced his curse on the Amalekites, which resulted in their total elimination as a people. Did that happen right then? You see, Haman should not even been alive, but they weren't wiped out like they were supposed to be. God had pronounced judgment upon those people. It says, although Saul received orders to kill all the Amalekites, including their king Agag, he disobeyed and incurred God's displeasure. Samuel, the prophet, finally hacked Agag into pieces. And because of his lineage from Agag, Haman carried deep hostility toward the Jews. So here we are much later, and Haman hates the Jewish people because of what they have done to his ancestors. It says the time of Esther arrived 550 years after the death of Agag. But in spite of such passage of time, neither Haman the Agagite nor Mordecai the Benjamite had forgotten the tribal feud that still smoldered in their souls. This explains why Mordecai refused to bow down to Haman, and why Haman so viciously attempted to exterminate the Jewish race. As expected, God's prophecy to extinguish the Amalekites and God's promise to preserve the Jews prevailed. So we see in Esther that this is taking place. So when Mordecai refused to bow, the Jewish people actually would bow to kings. You could find other passages that they did that. The reason he wasn't bowing to Haman, who wasn't even the king, was because that he was an Agagite. He hated him. So there was hate going both ways. This is Esther 3, 1 through 7. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him. So this is the same role that Mordecai actually eventually gets. Verse 2. And all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were within the king's gate said to Mordecai, why do you transgress the king's command? Now it happened when they spoke to him daily, and he would not listen to them, that they told it to Haman, to see whether Mordecai's words would stand. For Mordecai had told them that he was a Jew. So Mordecai told them his heritage. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow or pay him homage, Haman was filled with wrath, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Now he could have just killed Mordecai, right? But this shows how deep this hatred of the Jewish people were. For he said he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast Pur, that is the lot. This is why it's called Purim, because this is where the lot is cast. So they cast a lot before Haman to determine the day and the month until it fell on the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Now, ironically, when he was casting this lot in the month of Nisan, this is where Passover should have been celebrated. So they would be remembering God's deliverance for them, and now they're about to be attacked again. And there's about an 11-month wait in between when that lot was cast and when the order was actually going to be enacted. Now, another thing we need to see about the sovereignty of God through this is also the actions of the devil. Because the devil is the one that placed this in Haman's heart. The devil's always trying to destroy the Messiah ultimately. Because if the Jewish people were wiped out, where would the Messiah come from? Over and over again, the Jewish race, they tried to wipe through Satan's work.
Still working on it.
Yeah, but you know what? The Messiah's come now, so it's not really going to change anything. But you know, even when Jesus was born, what happened to the babies in Bethlehem? They were murdered. Again, Satan's just continually trying to wipe out the Jewish people. Going on, this is the next passage, Esther 3, 8 through 9. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore, it's not fitting for the king to let them remain." Now you notice Haman doesn't identify the Jewish people there. He just says, there's a certain people that's dispersed in your land. They're causing problems. Their laws are different from our laws. Now truly, their laws were different, weren't they? Because they had the law from God. And he says that the king doesn't need to leave them there. It's going to be a problem. So verse 9, "If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work to bring it into the king's treasuries." Now that's around 375 tons of silver. That's a lot. That was probably about 70%, it's estimated, of the king's annual revenue in the kingdom. Now where was he going to get all this from? They kill the Jews, they take their money. And it shows, they took all their stuff. And it shows too that the Jewish people had somewhat of wealth at this time, even though they were in a foreign land. So God had been blessing them in their work as well. He was going to take all of their money, their plunder. That's why it points out whenever the Jewish people were defending themselves, they didn't take the plunder of the people. But that was the plan that Haman had. Esther 3 and 13. "And the letters were sent," so the king listens to him, "and the letters were sent by couriers into all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions." Look how it just emphasizes, what are they to do? Destroy, kill, annihilate, wipe out the Jewish people fully. Now, historians believe that this was March 7th, 473 BC. So a very exact date that they were supposed to go and kill. And not just the men, the young and old, the little children and the women as well. Wipe out all of the people. So that was the order. But it didn't work out, did it? So as you go further in the book of Esther, eventually you have the situation with Mordecai, where the king honors Mordecai, and Haman's very upset about it, because remember, he was thinking that the king was going to honor him, and now he has to parade Mordecai through the streets. And this is from that section, Esther 6, 12 through 13. And we see again that the people knew something about the Jewish people from this. "Afterward, Mordecai went back to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, 'If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him.'"
History tells us that.
They knew, didn't they? They knew. He's like, if this man really is Jewish, I mean, your fall is already coming. You know, all the stuff he had just told them, that he was going to have to parade Mordecai in the streets and give him honor. And his wife and the wise men said, if Mordecai really is of Jewish descent, you're not going to prevail against him. And that's exactly what we see in this book. Esther 8 and 17. So this is after The Jewish people had defended themselves. And in every province and city, wherever the king's commanded decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land, catch this, many of the people of the land became Jews because fear of the Jews fell upon them. There was a revival in the land, and it's God who saves.
Sounds like the Democrats turning Republican, doesn't it?
It's much greater than that. And here's the thing. These people saw that the God of Israel was greater than their gods. In this time period, their Persian king had just lost battle to Greeks. I mean, it was a terrible loss. And they were thinking, well, our gods obviously didn't defeat the Greek gods, but this Israel's God seems to be pretty strong. And they were convicted. And it says that many of them became Jews. And guess what? People that truly follow God, where are they going to go when they die? To heaven. There's a great revival. You see, there's good coming out of this situation, even though there was much evil going on. When they were trying to wipe out the Jewish people, instead, more people became converted to the one true God. Going further, and we see that the people had to depend upon God. And we see this with Mordecai. We saw it earlier with Esther when she was asking the Jewish people to pray for her. And it's a very similar thing here. Esther 4, 1 through 3. So this is after the order had come for all the Jews to be killed. Mordecai hears it. When Mordecai learned all that had happened, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city. He cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went as far as the front of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province where the king's commanded decree arrived, there was great mourning among the Jews. Now what did they do? With fasting, weeping, and wailing in many lands, sackcloth and ashes. What were they doing? They were crying out to God. They were praying. They were petitioning God to intercede on their behalf. And we see that that's exactly what God did. And God turned their sorrow into joy. Esther 9, 19 through 22. Therefore, the Jews of the villages who dwelt in the unwalled towns celebrated the 14th day of the month of Adar with gladness and feasting, as a holiday, and for sending presents to one another. So this is Purim, and the people that were in the unwalled towns were outside of the capital of Shushan. And it says in verse 20, And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews near and far, who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th day of the month of Adar. So again, that's March 23rd and 24th this year. This is the celebration. So verse 22, as the days on which the Jews had rest from their enemies. And certainly that is heaven, is ultimately rest from our enemies. And it goes on, as a month which was turned from sorrow to joy for them, and from mourning to a holiday. They should make them days of feasting and joy, of sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. So this is why they give to charity during Purim as well. And one last thing in the book of Esther, it just popped out to me, is there's really a compare and contrast of kings as we look at this. You look at the king of Persia and you look at the one true king. So this first part is Esther 1, 13 through 14. Then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for this was the king's manner toward all who knew law and justice, those closest to him being Carshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Mersina, and Memucan, and 7 princes of Persia and Media, who had access to the king's presence and who ranked highest in the kingdom. I wanted to point this out because when the king had a decision to make, who did he ask? The wise men. He always had to have counsel around him, right? He didn't know all. He didn't know all the aspects of the law. He didn't know what to do in every situation. What about the one true king? Does God need counsel from anyone?
No.
Does God need to be told anything?
No.
So this king is puny. Going on to Esther 4 and 11. As all the king's servants and the people, the king's provinces know, that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king, who has not been called, he has but one law, put all to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. So this is the big situation before Esther approaches the king. And I thought about with this. So nobody could approach the king unless they were called. What would happen if they weren't called? They're put to death. What about the one true king? Can you just approach his presence on your own account? Or do you have to have invitation to come before him? Do you have to have...
And be invited.
That's right. If you try to approach the king on your own behalf, death comes to you. So you see, there's always these parallels and these aspects that we can understand a little bit more about our relationship with God, even from earthly kingdoms, earthly kings, and earthly situations. So we can't just approach God on our own terms. It's only by the blood of Christ that we can come before him and that we won't lose our life. And as it says, Esther had to be bold to go before the king that day. Through Christ, we approach the throne of grace with what? Boldness. We know who God is. God is in control. And this last point, this is Esther 7 and 10. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath subsided. Yet again, a little picture thing here. Does God have wrath?
Yes.
Yes, he absolutely does. And you see, the king here, his wrath was subsided by the death of Haman. How is God's wrath appeased? How does it subside? Jesus' death. As he took that cup of wrath that we deserve. Now, what if we don't accept Jesus? We're going to be the ones hung on the gallows, thrown on the spikes. So through all this in Esther, again, it doesn't explicitly say God, doesn't explicitly say heaven, but we see the people recognize that God is in control, that God is sovereign, that God is the one who brings the rescue and preserves the people. So on Purim, I read at the beginning of these blessings that the people would read before they read the book of Esther. There's also a blessing after the reading. So I'll read this. So again, listen to this, what the Jewish people think about God from the book of Esther. Blessed are you, my Lord, our God, King of the universe, the God who takes up our grievances, judges our claim, avenges our wrong, who brings just retribution upon all enemies of our soul and exacts vengeance for us from our foes. Blessed are you, my Lord, who exacts vengeance for his people Israel from all their foes, the God who brings salvation.
What was that reference again?
This is the prayer that they use in this holiday now.
Okay.
So when they would get together for this holiday, March 24th and 25th, they'd read that first part that I had, and they'd read the whole book of Esther, and then they would read that last part. And there were some other prayers as well. You're welcome to the sheet if you'd like.
That's okay.
So they recognize it is only God who saves, and ultimately that's what we have to continue to recognize. It is only God who saves, and God is in control. Even when there's many enemies pressing upon us, we know that all of God's enemies will ultimately be destroyed. They will be judged. And as the Bible tells us, the last enemy to be destroyed is what? Death. So there's victory. So God's work in Esther, and the big overarching theme is God is sovereign. God is in control. God blesses those who bless Israel, and God curses those who curse Israel. That's very plain. A promise made to Abraham, very plain as the people were suffering in this foreign land. And we also see that there is a fear of death. It's just something that goes across cultures. But for those who are in Christ, we have no reason to fear death. Anybody have anything to add or questions? That was a 44-minute flyover of Esther tonight. But again, it's not a love story. It's not a love story. It's really talking, well, if we say it's a love story, it's a love story of God and his people, not Esther and this king. And again, the king was actually assassinated not long after this book was written as well. Now, next week we won't be doing our regular heaven study. We're going to be looking at Isaiah 53, and that's going to be in the sanctuary. Got a lot of neat things to go with that. But then we'll pick back up, I think it's the book of Malachi next. And then we'll be getting into 1st and 2nd Chronicles. No, then we'll be getting into Nehemiah, and then 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and we'll be done with the Old Testament. So it's been a long journey, and soon we'll be running in the New Testament, and there's going to be a lot more about heaven in the New Testament. All right, well, let's close with prayer tonight. Father, I do thank you for your faithfulness. I thank you that we can rest in knowing that you are sovereign, that you are in control, and that there is nothing that can separate us from your love. And I thank you for that great truth. I thank you that Jesus took that cup of wrath that we deserve, and now we know that in Christ there is no condemnation, that we do not have to have this fear of death. And Father, as we face enemies in this life, we certainly will. We'll face physical enemies and spiritual enemies as well. Father, I pray that we would just continue to have a boldness in walking with you, trusting that you are in control, trusting that you have hold of our souls, for you are the King of the universe. You are the God that is in control, the God that sees all, the God that knows all. And Father, as we go through trials, let us be like the Jewish people as well and just have this great desire to cry out to you, to intercede on behalf of our situation. And Father, we thank you that we know that you hear our prayers through your Son, by your Spirit. And Father, I pray that you just help us all to continue to have a boldness in our lives and to have rest from all our enemies. In the holy name of Jesus, I pray. Amen.